Look at the events you've written down. Is it real to you that the conclusion you reached, what I have to say is not important, is a valid interpretation of those events? Can you agree that virtually any child at that age and in those circumstances would have reached a similar conclusion? Now we're going to play the possibilities game. We'll imagine that 4 friends of yours are visiting you and looking at a videotape of the events you just wrote down. Your interpretation of those events when you were a child was, what I have to say is not important. That is one valid interpretation of Mom and Dad's behavior. That interpretation wasn't wrong, but there are other reasonable interpretations of the same childhood events that you just didn't think of as a child. So let's ask each of your friends for another alternative interpretation. Can you see that one friend might well say, maybe Mom and Dad didn't think what you had to say was important, but that doesn't necessarily mean no one will. Couldn't the events in your childhood be explained by this interpretation just as well as your interpretation, that what I have to say is not important? Here's what your second friend says. Maybe back then people weren't interested in what you had to say. After all, you were just a kid talking about kid stuff. That doesn't mean that people would never be interested in what you have to say when you grow up. Doesn't this interpretation also explain those events in your childhood just as well as your interpretation, that what I have to say is not important? Here's a third possible interpretation of your childhood events that one of your friends suggests. Maybe Mom and Dad thought what you had to say was important, and their behavior was due to having a lot on their minds much of the time. Doesn't this interpretation also explain those events in your childhood just as well as your interpretation, that what I have to say is not important? Here's another interpretation from your fourth friend. Your parents didn't listen to you because they lacked effective parenting skills. They just didn't realize the effect of their not listening. It wasn't because what you have to say is not important. Couldn't any one of these interpretations explain your childhood interactions with your parents just as well as your interpretation, what I have to say is not important? Of course they can. So is it real to you that a belief you've lived with almost your entire life, something you thought was a fact, is not a fact, isn't the truth at all? It's only a truth, merely one interpretation of many possible interpretations of earlier events, right? With a little help from me and your friends, you can see that not always being able to get your parents to listen when you wanted them to listen as a child could have at least 4 different reasonable interpretations or meanings. Do you remember what you wrote down a few minutes ago as the source of your belief what I have to say is not important? Look at the text box below on your screen. Right now, imagine seeing what you saw then and hearing what you heard then. Now take a few minutes and really imagine the events of your childhood that led you to forming the belief what I have to say is not important. Didn't it seem when you were a child as if you could actually see what I have to say is not important in those early events with your parents? It did, didn't it? You may have the sense you didn't see the belief, you felt it. Once you formed the belief what I have to say is not important, you probably did feel it. I'll get back to the feeling in a minute. But what I'd like you to focus on now is not the feeling, but on my question. When your parents didn't pay attention to you, didn't it seem as if you saw what I have to say is not important? As if you could point to it? As if you could have said to me, Morty, can't you see what I have to say is not important? I didn't hear you. Did you say yes? Now that you think you saw what I have to say is not important as a child, I'd like you to look again. Did you really see what I have to say is not important? If you did, what does what I have to say is not important look like? Can you really point to it? Does what I have to say is not important have a color, a shape, location? Is it real to you now that you saw events, but never really did see what I have to say is not important? If anything you can really see can be described, and if you can't describe what I have to say is not important looks like, Is it clear now that you never really saw it? Since you never really saw what I have to say is not important, what did you actually see? Is it clear now all you really saw was your parents not paying attention to you when you wanted their attention? In other words, all you really saw was a series of events. See, what happened was that you looked at a series of events that can be interpreted in many different ways. You gave the events one meaning, which was, what I have to say is not important. By attributing that specific meaning to the events, each time your parents didn't listen to what you had to say, it was as if you could see that meaning in those situations. But you didn't discover the meaning in the events, you gave the meaning to the events. They had no meaning before you created one. Is it real now that the events had no meaning until you gave one to them? Here's another way to understand that events have no inherent meaning. When I say that, I'm saying you don't know anything for sure about whether what you say is important or not as a result of these childhood experiences. What do I know for sure about how much attention people will pay to you in the future? Is it clear that I wouldn't know anything? And if I don't know anything, you don't either. All you know for sure is what actually happened. Sometimes you weren't able to get your parents to listen to you when you were a child. And finally, if you never saw what I have to say is not important out there in the world, where has it been all these years? Did I hear you say that what I have to say is not important has only existed in your mind? That you never did see it out there in the world? That's right. If the belief is more real to you as a feeling than as a concept, here's another way to look at it. Didn't it seem as if your parents' behavior and comments when you were a child made you feel what I have to say is not important? But you just agreed that the events have no meaning. Is it possible for events that have no meaning to make you feel what I have to say is not important, or anything else for that matter? Of course not. So frequently not getting the attention you wanted from your parents when you were a child couldn't have made you feel what I have to say is not important. What did make you feel that? By now I think you know the answer to that question. Please answer out loud. That's right. You felt that only because that's the meaning you had already given to frequently not getting what you wanted. Let me help you make this real. Imagine that I had been there when you were a little child, and it helped you realize there were alternative interpretations. And after that conversation you concluded, maybe Mom and Dad weren't interested in what I had to say, but that doesn't necessarily mean no one would be interested. Here's what I'd like you to do now. Take a moment and really imagine being a child and wanting Mom or Dad's attention, and they just won't pay attention to you. As you imagine the events, apply this different interpretation to their behavior. Notice how it feels to be a child who's thinking, maybe Mom and Dad don't think what I have to say is important, but that doesn't necessarily mean no one would. You can use the pause button below to pause the video while you make these childhood scenarios more real for yourself. When you're done imagining, press the play button. As you imagine this scene, does it still feel like your parents' words and actions are making you feel what I have to say is not important? Probably not. And if you didn't feel what I have to say is not important then, would you feel it now? Again, the answer is no. So Mom and Dad's behavior never caused you to feel what I have to say is not important. That feeling came from your interpretation of their behavior. And since your feelings were not caused by events in reality, they were only the result of a meaning you made up to explain the events, is it real that the feelings you had when you couldn't get your parents' attention as a child didn't tell you anything at all about whether or not other people would be interested in what you had to say as an adult? They didn't, did they? Okay, now take a deep breath, let it out slowly, and then say out loud, what I have to say is not important. Is it the truth? Does it still feel like the truth? Your answer is very important here. Take another deep breath and say, what I have to say is not important, out loud. I'll bet it feels very different when you say these words now than when you said them at the beginning of this exercise. Do these words feel true even a little bit? Unless the belief is 100% gone and the words don't feel true at all, you probably still have the belief. Remember, holding a belief is like being pregnant. You either is or you ain't. There's no sort of. If the belief is still there, it probably still seems like you saw it. Once it no longer seems as if you saw what I have to say is not important, in those early events, the belief will be gone. So please click the repeat button to repeat that step of the process. If the belief is gone, please click continue.